welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We are happy to have you and happy to be assembling such a great panel on a particularly pertinent conversation this evening. So thank you again for joining us. I guess to cover a couple of the typical questions, we are recording this session for yourself or any others who may not be here tonight and want to revisit it. And we certainly will be taking questions. We are going to have a Q&A period at the end of the conversation. However, if you have any questions, feel free to populate the chat box with them throughout the call. We're going to go ahead and jump right in to kick off our conversation. So let's see, with a little bit of polls to see who is here with us tonight. So, Joseph, do you mind kicking us off with the poll? Great, thank you so much. So if everybody doesn't mind taking a minute or two to fill out the poll as you're receiving it, we'll go ahead and share the results, and that'll get us started to see who here is joining us this evening. For those that are just joining us, welcome. We are just kicking off with some audience polls to see who all is joining us this evening. So hopefully you're seeing the poll on your panel. Feel free to populate it, and we'll review the results in just a moment or two, and we'll get going.
It is more than half have responded to the poll.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Joseph. So let's go ahead and look at the results. So great to see we got a little bit of representation here. No surprise here, plenty of architects and designers. Great to have a GC and other. Sorry, we may not have captured your your profession here, but we're happy to have you. Good range of experience this evening. Great to see as well. And excited to see that it does look like a good number of people have heard of deconstruction before, albeit one person not just yet. So you're in the right place. And pretty even split of experience deconstructing buildings in the past. So happy to have that diversity, and similarly diversity of maybe having the opportunity, but not yet. So great. Thank you so much for bearing with us through those and for your responses. So with that, we will move on forward. So we have a quick COTE statement to kick us off here. Actually, apologies. We're going to go ahead and flash up our learning objectives for our event this evening for deconstruction, demolition, and reuse. I'm sure you've seen these, but these are the topics we'll be covering, and the event is good for 1.5 learning units. And with that, I'll go ahead and kick it over to Jyothna, who has a quick COTE committee statement to share for where we're at with things.
Sure, thanks, Alex. So at the outset, one of the reasons why we were really this topic about material reuse and deconstruction assumes special significance is because of what the slide says, that buildings in itself accounts to bulk of the carbon emissions. And as most of you would be knowing, the IPCC, as a follow-up to the Paris Climate Agreement, set up a carbon budget of 340 gigatons of CO2. Now, for those of us who have carried out embodied carbon analysis would have realized that every new construction project that is currently in the design phase or have been recently constructed itself emits several tons of CO2. And 340 gigatons of CO2 assumes it's really not that much. And on that note, reusing materials and deconstruction reduces the embodied carbon significantly and also brings a lot of financial benefits to the project. And here is where our very own Alex and our expert panelists are going to talk about the important question, which is how. So I'm going to hand it over to Alex.
Thank you so much, Josna, and thank you for starting us off with that. So deconstruction versus demolition, a kind of a key defining term to start us off with tonight. So with that, I just want to say welcome again, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us this evening. Tonight we'll be discussing material deconstruction and reuse, focusing on these as what we hope to become the trending preference over traditional demolition. As a primer, demolition is currently the typical end-of-life scenario for a building, resulting in most, if not all parts, ending up in a landfill. Some policies exist today that help to divert some of this waste, but for the most part, these buildings are still ultimately wasted. Deconstruction instead opts to disassemble the worthwhile elements of the building, enabling those parts, pieces, and appliances to be reused on another project. Now, before I introduce our amazing panelists who help us further enlighten us on this topic, I also want to set the context that we're in. The Pritzker Prize-winning architects of this year, Anne Lacaton and Jean-Philippe Vassal, were touted for their ability to re-examine sustainability and their reverence for pre-existing structures, conceiving projects by first taking inventory of what already exists. Ms. Lacaton noted that transformation is the opportunity of doing more and better with what is already existing. Demolition is a decision of easiness and short term, but is a waste of many things, a waste of energy, material, and a waste of history. Subsequently, firms have bought into this precept and have made commitments to not only reuse existing buildings going forward, but embody the changes that we're discussing. All the while, we face ever-increasing challenges of climate change and material scarcity. We as architects and designers within this AEC profession are well positioned to make and advocate for change. Tonight, we bring to you several inspiring individuals who can help enable and inspire you to do the same, particularly through deconstruction and reuse. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Ted Reef, President of the Reuse People. Go ahead and get my slides up here. Leslie Suh of Leslie Suh Appraisals, and Marcus Hopper of Gensler in San Francisco. Welcome you all, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. So I am going to pass it off to Ted to start, who is going to speak a little bit about himself, and then subsequently we'll go to Leslie and Marcus before we jump into our panel discussion. All yours, Ted. I'm going to go ahead and respond to what you have.
Thanks very much, Alex, and good afternoon, almost good evening to everyone. I started the Reuse People about 29 years ago, and we in our efforts, it was very difficult. We had to really educate a lot of people, and that's one of the problems with deconstruction. Is it's just a continual education problem and opportunity. But in that education period over the last 28, almost 30 years, we have been able to deconstruct or be part of the deconstruction of over 4,000 buildings. Those include military, commercial, one movie set. Anybody remember Matrix, Revolutions and Reloaded? We did those. Those are filmed up in the Bay Area. And we have diverted over 450,000 tons of material from the landfill. We have partner organizations around the country that we partner with and contractors. We've trained a lot of contractors, a little over 50 to be exact. We've trained over 500 workers, getting them into not only deconstruction but into various trades within the construction industry. And our whole focus is simply on reusing materials. Now we don't reuse them ourselves; we provide them for reuse. So we have a large retail warehouse in Oakland and other distribution warehouses throughout the country. And most recently, in the last couple of years, we also opened in Vancouver, Canada. So that's us, the Reuse People of America and the Reuse People of Canada. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ted. Alrighty, passing it on to you, Leslie, and I'm going to go ahead and put your slides up right now.
There we go. Hi, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to participate. This is a really important topic, so happy to be able to share my involvement in our circular economy and in deconstruction. I'm a personal property appraiser, and I specialize in valuing used building materials. So the materials that we are salvaged from the careful hand deconstruction of projects. I'm based in the San Francisco Bay Area and Lake Tahoe, but personal property appraisers, deconstruction appraisers can work across the nation. We're not licensed by any state. So, we can work across the nation. But my focus is primarily the San Francisco Bay Area. I got into this originally about a little over 10 years ago when my architect for a project I was building told me to Google deconstruction and do deconstruction for a project of mine. And I met with a couple people, and I didn't choose to do deconstruction because I didn't feel like I had a trusted team. So I think it's really important that together we assemble trusted teams. And I think, this hopefully tonight will be the beginning of helping people feel comfortable, understanding who the players are to make a successful project. So anyway, my focus is primarily on residential deconstruction projects. Haven't been very involved in commercial projects, and I'm not exactly sure if that's because commercial projects have other incentives other than donation and the tax benefit. And that's where the appraisal comes in, is when somebody donates the materials, they can take a tax write-off. It's not a tax credit, it's a tax write-off. And I have a feeling, and I'm not sure, maybe some of the folks participating tonight know the answer, but I think businesses might take the loss as a business loss and not as a donation tax write-off. So anyway, that's, I think, why my focus has been primarily residential. I have, and I can share these later, but I have some kind of project examples that we can share with some numbers so that people can see exactly how the financial aspects of deconstruction for donation and the appraisal all work together. But we can do that maybe later if necessary. So anyway, thank you. Look forward to talking to everyone.
Thank you so much, Leslie. And apologies for my my operator error on the slides here. Hopefully you guys will be able to see these, or can continue to see these. I'm going to not do full screen here because it seems to be giving me an error. So quick thumbs up that this is still showing up. Okay. Yes. Good to go, Marcus.
Yeah, I got it. Perfect. Thanks, Alex. Hey, everybody.
Right ahead. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks. Hey, everybody. Good evening. Marcus Hopper from Gensler. So happy to be here with Leslie and Ted tonight. So let's go on to the next slide. I can really quickly just high level because I want to get into the conversation because I think that's where we're going to unpack a lot of stuff there. But Gensler has a research institute, and so we have design teams that are currently working on projects, but we also invest in research. So 2 research papers that I'll discuss high level tonight, and dig a little deeper into the What's Old is New Again research paper, which was put out in 2019, which was a part of a team that I was involved with. We had a Designing for Disassembly paper that just went out last year, which came out of our Newport Beach office. but I think research does inform our work, and I think it's very important. So let's go to the next slide, Alex, and I can probably just quickly high level what's old is new again in that research. What was it about? So in that research, we kind of studied ourselves as an organization. We build out offices all the time, and so we kind of took a step back. At the time, we were looking at the build out and focusing on the build out of our San Francisco office, which was a temporary office for 5 years. Our lease was only a 5-year lease. And so I was managing that project. So our research team reached out to other teams that had just recently completed their offices, our Denver team, London, San Diego, New York. And we just wanted to see what were we doing in kind of the space of reuse? Like what were the practices that we were putting forward? Next slide, please. Yeah, so there were kind of 5 findings. The top 3, the first 3 were kind of like overall just general findings, and then the last ones were more like design implications, like how could we start to look at this a little deeper and embed it into our process. So the first thing was need in the market. We identified there is a need in the market. It's there, and the need, there's savings and there's also benefits from that need if we start to adopt a circular economy approach, right, in our design. Sector impact, like as we look at office build out specifically, interior build outs, there's waste that's associated with that. And so by just looking at our methodology, our processes, our project goals, and tweaking those, we can start to reduce that waste. We identified kind of this undefined waste stream, and it's usually in the product life cycle. It's between the kind of part where there's the products in use and then it goes out of use. There's this kind of gray area that is somewhat undefined, and sometimes a lot of this is localized, and this is where partners like Ted and Leslie could kind of help us as architects and designers figure out what that is, right? Dig into that a little deeper. Partnerships are super important. We always have our partners in our projects. We go to, we have great, strong builders, contractors that we work with. We have engineering teams that we work with. Partnerships are going to be essential as we start to unpack this. And partnerships with folks like Leslie and Ted are going to be critical in moving this forward. And then the design process, thinking about reuse doesn't just happen at the end, it also or just at the beginning, it happens throughout the process. So those are the kind of key findings. The next slide, and this is the last one. So just kind of enablers for the circular economy. The first one is just like a commitment. And I think for all of you that are on the call tonight, you're committed. You've kind of raised your hand and you're here. So just by being on the call, there's going to be a commitment to kind of move this forward. Incentives are going to be very important. And I think that, this comes down to our local jurisdictions. And, Ted just posted on the chat a paper that he wrote that talks a little bit about this ordinances, for instance. So incentives are going to be very important. This is where we start to work with our local jurisdictions and kind of figure that out. Communication, stakeholder engagement. This is kind of the kind of human interaction that we're going to need to have. And this is with our clients, with our colleagues. And really, these are going to be the drivers. The conversations that we have are the things that's going to move this forward, right? What are the incentives beyond just emission savings that are really going to push this forward? Data appropriation is part of a big picture. So metrics will tell the story, and so this is where we start to look at organizations like the AIA to help us start to figure out what are the metrics, where are the savings that we can then start to inform our projects, our teams, our clients. And then investment and training. Ted brought this up. It's not just going to be we're going to flip a switch and we're going to be in this, this wonderful circular economy where we're reusing on our projects. It's going to take investment and time. And it's not just for the design profession, it's for our contractor partners, it's for our engineering teams. So there's going to need to be this investment and training to kind of remove this risk and uncertainty that Leslie kind of brought up, right? There's this fear right now. It's kind of fringe. I think this is going to help us move forward. So that's a little bit high level. I posted the 2 research papers on the chat, What's Old is New Again, and Designing for Disassembly, which we call D2. So take a look at it, and we'll talk about it a little further during our panel tonight. That's it, Alex. That's all I had.
Great. Thank you so much, Marcus.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcus, and thank you again, everybody, and welcome. We're going to go ahead and kick off our panel. So the first question I want to ask you all, but we'll start with you, Ted, is what can and can't be deconstructed, and how what are some of the drivers that go into what you can and can't, and why you would or wouldn't?
Well, regardless of whether it's residential or commercial, anything that's built out is substantially out of CNU or any type of concrete product is just can be salvaged for recycling, but it can't be reused. So what we're looking for are wood frame structures, some steel structures, of course, again, especially in the commercial business, and a lot of those. But a lot of the chilled up commercial buildings have wood roofs. They have wood decking. They have glulands. They have wood trusses. There's also a lot of interior. Well, again, if they're steel, those studs, then those can certainly be recycled. If they're wood studs, older wood studs, those can be salvaged. On the residential side, it's easier to talk about what can't be reused. Again, things like concrete, asphalt, shingles, stucco, drywall, plaster. And that's about it. You know, depending upon their condition, that is a reusable condition, anything else can be reused. We do everything from carpeting to light fixtures, lumber, obviously, windows, doors, cabinetry, hardware, commercial hardware. In fact, when we did a large project up in Truckee, a ski resort, we had over 3 tons of just hardware that we were able to save. And so there is a lot that can be. It's almost easier to talk about what can't be than what can be.
So in terms of the materials then that are most often reused, right, that are also in high demand, I'm curious from you all what are some trends that you all are seeing there? Oh,
well, yeah, lumber are the three top ones. Not only is that the largest component, at least from a bulk standpoint, not necessarily weight, but from a bulk standpoint, that's the largest single item within a building. But on the other hand, on the buying end or the reusing end, more people, I think, are looking for lumber than they are kitchen sinks. So those can be people who are doing their own DIY projects, or people who are fashioning them into other products, making tables, making chairs, remilling them for trim, flooring, that sort of thing. So lumber probably is the largest product that we salvage and rarely get enough of, and it's also got the highest consumer demand.
Leslie and Marcus, maybe starting with you, Leslie, and then jump to you, Marcus. What are could each of you maybe speak to some of the drivers or interests in these materials that help fuel that economy?
Yeah, I think the affordability of buying on the secondary market, buying used building materials, you know, the ability to, say, purchase a Viking range when their budget wouldn't normally be able to allow them to buy that quality of a product. So I think that we see a fairly strong market for the Viking ranges, professional grade appliances, especially ones that aren't necessarily digital, they don't have the electronic components. So, they're pretty simple in construction and they're workhorses. They last for a long time. So your typical useful life of a range doesn't apply with some of those professional grade, very high-end appliances. I think the other thing that I see in doing market research is smaller items, items that don't necessarily need a contractor to install. So hardware, things that are easily shipped from, one state to another state. If you, especially with COVID, you go to eBay online stores, a lot of these secondary marketplaces, you can, find these items on eBay and they'll ship it to you. So you don't actually even have to go into a brick and mortar store. So I think, the market's pretty strong for those types of items as well.
Marcus,
Yeah.
did you have?
Yeah, I could
go ahead.
Yeah, I think just to add to what Ted and Leslie were saying. So I think I think it comes down to there's an incentive in time savings, right? So having the materials that you're not having to wait for it to be manufactured,
Right.
and there's a procurement, right? There's savings by just having this stuff, even if it's local or not local, right? You could ship it. If there are doors that are available and they happen to be, 500 miles away, you're going to be able to get them faster than having it manufactured and sent to you from, factory, right? That saves on embodied carbon and all the things that we're talking about, right? That's like a huge driver for climate change. So yeah, so I think, for our projects, like if you look at just say interiors, specifically doors and frames, sometimes ceiling systems can be easily disassembled and reassembled, right? Carpet tile has always been, like projects have moved over to carpet tile. I don't think I see any broadloom tile anymore for commercial projects, because and so it's how you apply the tile though. So getting away from glue to like sticky kind of, there's like an adhesive sticker that is used so that the tile can be removed. You're not having to spend the time to remove all of the glue and everything. So that comes back to like designing for disassembly. We tend to focus on the things that have like the most impact, right, for embodied carbon. So like if you think about, the doors and ceiling systems that are easily disassembled, we try to look at things that are, like things that are probably going to have to be broken down, like metal studs and, chipboard and all that stuff. That's going to have to be probably put into recycling, right? Because it's going to be harder to disassemble and reuse. But yeah, I think it goes down to, it's just the time savings that is really the true kind of return on investment, specifically for our clients, that I think they'll find value in.
So Leslie, a question back to you. What does the process look like when it comes to fueling the economy with these with more materials to reuse? Where does it start?
So it starts really with an architect's new project, right? When they're designing a project, unless it's a project that's going to be built on bare land, something is probably going to need to be deconstructed or demoed. And it's, what walls are being removed, what areas are being remodeled. So, again, my focus is residential, so I'll focus on that. But let's say, for example, it's just a kitchen and bathroom remodel that an architect is, helping to design. There's a demo page in the plans, right? And that demo page is identifying what needs to be removed. And so it's at that point in time that we've identified that materials are no longer going to be used at that site, likely, right? And so then you would involve, ideally the architect would educate the client on deconstruction. And donation is just one of the options, but it's a pretty good option for clients. So you would bring in, the builder, a deconstruction contractor, an appraiser, a nonprofit. And really the process can start with any one of those people. And what's really important is that I think the critical thing to make sure is the critical team player at that point is really the nonprofit, because they're going to identify what they can accept, provided things are salvaged in good reusable condition. If there's not a nonprofit that will accept the materials, then they really determine the scope. So you've got the construction scope, then you've got the nonprofit that determines these are the items that we're able to accept. Then the deconstruction contractor, the appraiser can start putting together numbers based on that scope. And then they figure out the financial feasibility. You know, do they want to go deconstruction versus demolition? And in many cases, especially when we're talking about remodels, usually always makes financial sense. It usually is always financially advantageous to go deconstruction and donation as opposed to demolition. So does that answer the question, Alex?
Yeah, I think so. I think that touches right on it.
Yeah.
And so starting to follow the chain a little bit, I want to jump back to you, Ted. So what, you know, what's the next steps after that? We choose deconstruction, and you come into play. What follows, and then how can we start to maybe trace these materials? Where can we trace these materials as they're actually disassembled?
Yeah, typically we'll do a survey of the building before any construction or demolition or deconstruction is started. And it's that survey and photographs which identifies the materials. And as a nonprofit organization, what we're obviously interested in is understanding what the appraisal value is, which is where Leslie would come in. And so we would send the photographs and the survey that we did, a written survey with the quantity of materials and the quality to the appraiser. And typically they'll come up at no cost, though I'm not speaking for Leslie, but
it's still no cost at this point in time.
But it's at no charge. They'll get an estimate of what the value is. It would be a value range from X to Y, because you never know what the termites have done once we tear into the walls, and what doesn't get broken when it's taken out. But then we find out and recommend. Typically, we'll recommend which contractors to use. We've trained several in the Bay Area, and if someone wants to use their own contractor or a contractor that we have not trained, then we have a set of specifications that we give. And we say, we don't. I always have a joke with the contractor. I don't care if they use an atomic bomb to remove it, but here's how it's got to be delivered. And if it's not delivered in that respect, the way we want it, then the appraisal value is no good. So it's very critical that we get it in the quantity and the quality that's reusable.
I think one point that I wanted to add to what Ted's saying is that it's really important that the donor organization, the nonprofit, the deconstruction contractor, or whoever's going to be doing the salvaging, and the appraiser are all making sure that they're working from the same scope. So if I'm providing an estimate, you know, on a certain scope, and the deconstruction contractor goes in and they're providing a bid on something different, you know, we're going to have unhappy clients. So it's really important that those parties, we need to be independent of one another. The appraiser needs to be independent, but it's really important that we're looking, and all of our numbers are based on the same scope.
There was a point that Leslie brought up earlier too about the difference between a full deconstruction and a remodel. From a financial standpoint, and again, because we're a nonprofit organization, the financials are an important part of what we do, and the value of the materials. It's no longer, with a remodel, man against machine, like it is in a full deconstruction and full demolition. So consequently, the machine economically has always been a win. You've got the operator and engineer, you've got the truck driver, and you've got a guy running the hose to keep the dust down. You know, and that takes a day, maybe two, maybe three if it's a larger house. With deconstruction, that would be 2-3 weeks with 5 guys. So the cost difference is amazing, but with you can't, in a remodel, you can't put an excavator in the kitchen. Right. You know, it just doesn't fit. So the cost is it's still man, if you would, man against man. The demolition guy has a high disposal cost. The deconstruction guy has got a high labor cost, but no disposal, or minimal. So it's,
Right.
it's a much better balance.
I think we've discussed a lot of aspects of value, right? In often cases monetary, but
Right.
I think we touched briefly on earlier. There's a lot of benefits, a lot of reasons to deconstruct beyond that. Could we maybe starting back with you, Marcus, and working our way around as you all would like to contribute? Could you speak a little bit more to the different types of value that deconstruction and reuse can both offer to the product team, to the client?
Yeah. So I think, we talked about the incentives in terms of the shipping, receiving, the procurement piece of it, right? Things are here, they're readily available, they're in good condition, why would we not reuse it, right? There's obviously a benefit, as we start to see with some of our clients, there's a PR piece to this as well, right? I mean, we're all focused on climate change. We all lived in, California Bay Area. Skies were red last September, right? And I think it was a little bit of a wake-up call for some people that maybe was always kind of in the background. And so I think the PR story for a lot of our clients are, hey, we're looking at this from a social aspect as well, right? This is a huge thing that we need to start to look at, to the point where they're bringing people on that are really focusing on this. Like this is how we're also applying for work. Like they're asking for this, like as a criteria for selection as a design partner, right? So it's important to clients as they start to see this. There's a community impact thing as well, right? As we're starting to rebuild our communities, and like Leslie brought up the nonprofit piece. How are we going to start to build back our communities, right? We have over the last year, there's boarded up, streets that used to have service vendors, restaurants, retail, right? And so how do we start to build that back? And I think for me personally, the reuse story is about that. It's really trying to get those resources to those individuals that are in the greatest need. And if we are working on projects, commercial, residential, clients that are paying us to do this, if these materials that are not needed for those projects can be used for other projects, that's the greatest like benefit. And that's, I think, for us as a profession, all of us like on the call, that's like our biggest opportunity, right? It's kind of connecting the dots.
Yeah, Leslie or Ted, do you guys, either of you want to speak to that further?
And also think about how many jobs are created with deconstruction versus that bulldozer machine demo scenario. There's skilled labor jobs. So that's also, I think, a value.
Yeah, I think it gets into the whole training aspect that Ted brought up, right? Like if we had 100 TEDs, I don't know what the world, but I mean, you have, there's certain, so like it gets into like what Leslie was bringing up, like, so it starts with the drawings, right? So that everybody is like looking at the same information. And we, architects know that, right? It's like there's this set of drawings going to go out. Folks are going to start to look at it from, define their scope of work, or to price out the piece that they've been asked to price. But if we look at the plans are looking at the deconstruction piece of the project, right? And you need to have these like folks that really know how to do that, right? There starts to be this like small group of people that really know how to do. They have been trained. They have like the knowledge. Like if we could start to train more and more of those people, so it's not just like an exception, like, hey, only this group does that type of work. If we had every contractor informed on how to do this, right? And so I think that's where the training piece comes into play, where right now that it doesn't exist. And I think that's where there's a big opportunity. And going back to your point, Leslie, about jobs, right? That's just creates more job opportunity for people.
There's another aspect to it as well, but the training is a big one, and it's not only training for deconstruction. The construction industry is probably the least employed or the biggest gap in need of people to work of any profession in the bloody country. Projects are behind by months, not because of COVID, that's a big part of it, but mainly we can't get the material, we can't get the workers. So when we do deconstruction training, it's educating people into the most, well, first of all, most of them are inner city, most of them are underemployed, unemployed. And so we really have to start with the basic. They don't know a cat from a cat's paw. And so we really have to bring them up with safety to begin with, and just introduce them to all the tools. But then beyond that, another, it was touched on briefly, one of the resources are landfills, and we're losing landfills. For instance, the state of Connecticut has no C&D landfills. 100% of C&D is shipped out of the state, mostly to Pennsylvania and Ohio. And the cost of that shipping, you can imagine what it is. The other resource is embodied energy. The amount of embodied energy in the products which were salvaged is horrendous. An example, Forest Products Laboratory about 10 years ago did a study of virgin versus reused lumber. Not finished lumber, but just lump like framing lumber. And they found that virgin lumber is 11 to 13 times more energy consuming than reused. And that's a huge number. If you look at the kilo BTUs per pound that are in lumber, I mean, it's a huge number. So those are two resources that we don't want to lose sight of: landfill resources and embodied energy.
I think just like on adding to what you just said. So I think the embodied carbon piece, or the embodied energy piece, is kind of, you know, as buildings become more efficient, right? We were focusing so much. I mean, just say within California, right? The just code, you know, for energy Title 24, right? You know, we've been working on making our buildings much more efficient, right? And so it's really now this focus on embodied carbon, right? What's the energy that's needed to make the materials. And so this is where the reuse thing comes into play. We're going back to like the benefit, right? It's like the stuff is already here, right? You don't need to make it. You may have to refurbish it, renew it, but it's not like starting from scratch, right? And so that in itself, I think that's, if we start to, and I think that's where we're at this point in time where we need to like start to transition. Like we've continued to build our efficient buildings, right? We've studied that, and we're going to continue to work on that. But now this like reuse piece, right? The upcycling piece is going to be where we start to kind of focus in terms of design and how we think about projects.
Totally. I'm going to want to come back to that shortly, Marcus, but I want to quickly ask, we talked a little bit about some of the hurdles or challenges of deconstruction, right? It sounds like the maybe void in the availability of that type of work and skill set is one of them. Could one of you speak to what some of the other challenges are that our audience can anticipate and learn to navigate around for when they deconstruct their next project or start reusing more materials?
I think the biggest challenge is strictly education. Again, we started out 28 years ago thinking this is going to be a cakewalk. And I had forecasts, and because I'm a numbers guy, and so I had a bunch of forecasts and looking and said, oh boy, what is, you know, there's really a pony in this haystack. But what we have found out is that the demolition guys have had a better story and a longer run and more money to pour into it than the deconstruction folks have. And so it's really, and if you look at the rest of the country, California is so far ahead, and Northern California is so far ahead of Southern California. It's quite amazing. And again, we started out in Southern California, and that was one of the reasons we went to the Bay Area, is because at least the idea of recycling and reuse is already ingrained in a lot of folks. But education is the biggest. I think is the biggest hurdle we have to overcome.
I would say, Alex, like I think the starting early, starting real or like this, do you think, it's like pre-planning the planning in a way. It's like, so the earlier that you start, the better. And even if you think you're starting at the right time, you probably need to start a month or months before. So I think getting started earlier, bringing on the partners, like bringing someone like, Ted, bringing Ted on, bringing Leslie on early, having these conversations early at the big, with the client, I think is key. I think the challenge is, and what is the challenge? The challenge is time, right? There's just not enough time. It's like you're trying to like say, we want to start to implement this in process, but there's a fast timeline, right? You have to meet that. And so there's going to be a desire to just go back to the way, this normal path, right? This like typical path of doing things. And so if you want to implement reuse, right, on a project, and it hasn't been done before, maybe we're introducing it to the client for the first time, it goes back to the education piece that Ted talked about, but I think it's the timing piece, like getting in front of it sooner. The designing for disassembly plays a part of it, right? I think the first part is like, you're working with projects right now that weren't really designed in that way, right? So that's what we're having to spend a lot more time and energy figuring out how to disassemble. But going forward, right, if we start to think about this, right, it's like kind of a two-way, I kind of see it in two ways. Like we're looking at projects as we're deconstructing them and we're learning from that, like maybe the mistakes that were made. And then as we design our new projects, we're thinking about the future. Okay, we're not going to use nails. We're going to use screws, or we're not going to use like glue. Like we're going to think about it so that when teams have to come back and deconstruct these projects 10 years from now, they'll have an easier time doing it, right? And so, and those materials can be reused in a much more efficient way on a network that everyone is part of. So that's kind of benefit. That's long benefit story there. Opportunities and benefits, yeah. Challenges.
Yeah, no doubt about that. So I want to hone in a little bit more to the design team, especially given a lot of our audience today is in the design and architecture field and representing that sector. What beyond starting earlier, what nuances to the process are there when it comes to reusing materials? I guess maybe we'll focus on that because I know that's certainly been a large focus of your work, Marcus. Could you speak to some of the nuances?
Yeah. So I think like so one of the first things is the inventory piece, right? I think it's really just like understanding what do you have, right? So if you're working on a project, there's reuse, right? Like Leslie brought that up, like, okay, what are we going to, here's our program, here's our design, what do we currently have on site? So I think it's developing that inventory, and sometimes it's not always the architect that needs to do that. Sometimes we'll have partners that are helping us do that. There's, salvaging partners that will come on and do an inventory, and they'll do this at no cost, right? It's like this cost benefit analysis to show like, okay, here's what you have. If you're dealing with like, we do a lot of interior projects at Gensler, and there's a furniture component. So again, furniture partners will come on and do that inventory for us, and we can start to select like those materials. So that's the first piece. Along with that is educating the client, right? As they start to get the cost benefit analysis, as they start to look at, okay, these are the things that we will use. Here's the benefit of using it, cost, right? These things won't be used, right? The design team did not select these because they don't really fit within the concept. They're not functional. Finding a place, a new home for those is like part of the benefit as well. So it's the inventory piece. I think the contractor partnership is critical, right? I think having a contractor that understands this is important. So I think in the selection of the contractor, that's a very, very important part of the process. Sometimes, luckily, you'll have a contractor on board from the very beginning. So you're having these conversations together, but sometimes you're not in that situation. And at the end, it's really like this, and this is something that we're noodling around at Gensler trying to figure it out, but when the project is done, right, and you walk away from it, what are you leaving for the team after? Like, it may be your team, it may be a different team, but what are those instructions? Like the plans that you have, that record set, are there like essentially instructions for disassembly that you're leaving behind. You know, IKEA is like, you know, I'm not a fan, but they are like, they have instructions on how to put the furniture together, then also how to take it apart, right? So it's like this idea of disassembly is becoming a little bit more mainstream now, even just like in retail. So I think along the process, the inventory, the partnerships, and then this like thinking about the team after you, I think is these little inserts throughout the process that we are currently should focus on.
Fantastic. Ted and Leslie, I want to lob the question to you both as well, having both a ton of experience, you know, working with others to make this happen. Are there any advice, any advice that you have to offer for the design team for things to think about sooner rather than later?
I think Marcus has pretty well hit it. And I like his analogy of nails and screws. You know, but if it's glued together, we're screwed taking it apart. You know, there's, but the other is that once the inventory is done at that project, and we can see what's going to be used back into it, having the thought, and Marcus brought this up earlier, having the thought about where can we get more of this kind of thing, and start out. The commercial folks are familiar with the word hoarding, and even on residential, that's what we've got to do. We've got to get a container out there and start hoarding the materials that you wish to put back into that project. Or somebody's got to hoard them somewhere. In the Bay Area, that hoarding could get very expensive if you need a lot of warehouse space. But yeah, that's something you have to keep in mind. What are we going to be saving, and how are we going to save it, and where are we going to save it, and how readily available is it?
Yeah, I think, you know, Marcus bringing up the fact that as early as you can assemble the team and start understanding what can be reused, what's going to be retained for reuse on site, that will, I think that'll really eliminate a lot of the challenges, or a lot of, you know, why some people may choose not to deconstruct. The other thing that I think is really important is that instead of us thinking of what can we salvage and reuse from our demo project, what can we deconstruct from our demo project, I think we need to start thinking of every project as having deconstruction. And within that deconstruction, there will be some demo debris, but you know, every project has some amount of deconstruction opportunity. And I think we need to move away from demo being the verb that we use as kind of the default, and deconstruction needs to be the default in how we talk.
Absolutely. I'll offer one resource that I've heard of is buildings as material banks, and I think this is it's a great example of what you guys are speaking to. So the next question I want to ask you all, and I think it's directly in line with where we're going, is what are the sources? What are the resources that us designers can start to look to source this information? How do we start hoarding for the projects that we're able to start pulling reused materials from or for? Anybody want to take that one to start?
I think that's where there's that opportunity, right? I think it's like these resource networks that it's a marketplace, right? I think we've talked about like eBay, right? Or like, you know, things that are, you know, they're a Craigslist that is typically set up for, you know, sharing or selling. But I think that like this materials network, that, you know, if like Leslie was saying, if projects are seen, if these are material banks, right? Buildings as material banks, right? Things are just deconstructed. And then if folks are looking at materials for their projects, we don't need it for this project, but somebody else could use it, and you could upload it, post it to a materials bank, right? So just like design teams they go to a website, they look at, information when they're specifying something new, you could go over here and do the same thing on a reuse market, right? And so that way, because currently that doesn't exist it's in bits and pieces, right? And it may be for specific things, but if you could start to expand that, maybe initially start to build it locally and see how that works. How that tied in with like a reuse materials center where you're actually almost like a center that, where contractors are dropping off these materials, right? I think that would assist in.
So I think for the contractor, their resource is probably going to be the local nonprofit. And the local nonprofit, if I'm, understanding kind of what you're talking about, Marcus, and kind of this more like a virtual marketplace or build reuse. I don't know if everyone's familiar with that. And Ted, you may know more about this than I do, but if I'm not mistaken, Mike Gable has created something where it's like an online virtual nonprofit sharing source where, like, so for example, Habitat for Humanities are well known for not accepting a very wide variety of materials. It's a very narrow scope of materials that they'll accept. But, instead of having, for example, if you've got a habitat and they only want 20% of the materials that are salvageable and reusable, but there are other nonprofits out there that would like the other, 80% of those materials. How do we make it easy for the client, for the architect, for the builder? So, that they're not having to shop around and find 3 different nonprofit recipients. And ultimately it would be like Habitat or, and let's say the reuse people's great because they accept a very wide variety of materials. So I can't use them as a good example here. But say, Habitat is going to accept in materials, they'll be the recipient nonprofit, but they're only going to be able to sell X% through their restores, right? Well, if they're part of this network, this virtual nonprofit sharing network, then they would link up to TED and say, hey, here are these materials, or they would put these materials on that marketplace and other nonprofits could say, we would like these materials. Ted, are you familiar with that concept that Build Reuse is working on?
Yeah, and they literally, you're saying that they are working on it. It has not come to fruition. However, there's an organization that belongs to Build Reuse called Recapture It.
Yeah.
And they're an online store that just started up. There's been a couple of them over the last 15 years. But these folks have got, at least they've got the back end of this thing really wired. They take care of all the local sales taxes, all the state sales taxes. They take care of all the shipping costs. The buyer knows exactly what they're going to buy and pay for, and they're requiring their participants you set up your own store on their online, but you can visit all these other stores too, and they can be for profit, they can be not for profit, they can be they can be new guys.
Right.
New material brokers, but it's primarily Recapture It is the name of it, and is primarily used as what they're after. That's the direction that we're going to go. There is no question about it. For the simple reason that none of us can afford the real estate that it's going to take to keep all those materials, especially in the bloody Bay Area or Los Angeles or San Diego or New York.
Right.
Or, the real estate is too darn expensive. So we've got to go online, no question.
Well, and online, it's popular with younger generations, certainly. But especially since COVID, I think many people are embracing online shopping and have gotten used to that and have found that it's very easy. So not only is it good for the reseller, it's also good for the buyer.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me that Bezos or would get together with Habitat or with a Home Depot or Lowe's and really start blending new and used together because they've got the square footage, they've got the horsepower, and they've got the platform.
Right.
Exciting to think about what may be in store to only make this process easier. One thing I want to circle back on a little bit, you know, I think we haven't touched on it explicitly just yet, and that is what can salvage materials be used for? And I'm thinking specifically in kind of the raw materials. Obviously, if there was the Viking stove, you know, in its original form, we're gonna, you know,
Right.
take that in and sell it and reuse it for that exactly. But things like lumber that you talked about initially, Ted, or some of the finishes that you've spoken to, Marcus, are we able to use those in their for their original intent, or what purposes can things take on in their second life and thereafter?
Let's talk about lumber for a minute. And the following description was given to me by a building inspector. Okay, and for his safety reasons, I won't mention his name. But he said there's 3 ways you can do it. You call your local building inspector and show him the stack of used material, used lumber that you're going to be using, and he has got the capability of overriding any decision on code. The chances of him doing that are pretty slim, especially with all the new building inspectors coming on and going by the book. The older guys might do it. He said, but the second step is really quite critical, and that is go to your engineer.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and have the engineer, it's his license, it's his name that's on the line, it's his liability. You know, have him sign off on it. Now he may high grade the materials. Now you can't use 2x4s, better go to 2x6s, you know, something like that. And then thirdly, there's only one other step, and that was to have enough lumber available to afford a regrader to come in, to hire a grading guy, gal, come in and regrade the material that's sitting there on the site or on someone's site, be it in our warehouse or the building site or the deconstruction site. And we did a project like that in a project in Monterey. And it was a large supermarket that we took down. The roof was all 2x10 and 2x12, and they wanted to use that material on site. Well, we had enough of it that it warranted the developer hiring a grader to come in for a half a day and regrade all the material. Now, if you're not using it in a structural situation, you're just building a party wall and running some wire through it for electricity. That's one thing. But if it's for structural purposes, that clearly is not.
Like we might have just lost you there for a second, Ted, but but that's great to know. I don't know, Marcus or Leslie, if you wanted to carry on from there. I think Ted was just starting to speak to the alternate uses, right?
Yeah. So I think there's the carpet tile. We talked about like ceiling systems. Doors, like things are things that can be reused as is, right? Alternate things like in our Etsy project, we use like the water tower, the exterior. So it was an exterior. It was totally different, had a totally different life and function. And then that became the treads for the stair that we used to connect the space, right? And so it met the structural requirements that Ted was talking about. Obviously, we had to have like the carpenter, right? The contractor really had to like figure out like, here's just what that was outside, and now we have to bring it inside, and there's like conditions that you have to think about. But I think when you're going from that direction for something that was used in a much more, let's just say it had a different function in terms of structure, right? It was built for a higher use. and then you're bringing it inside, it's easier. So using it as a finished material, like we've done that before. The problem that we're having right now with the interior, again, I'm looking just interior projects, and it can be also commercial as well. It's like the technology pieces, like lighting is a huge one, right? Like as we started to make this, switch from fluorescent now to LED, and like there was a period where it's like, okay, we can retrofit these things, and we're kind of somewhere in between. But now we're really going more toward the LED piece. We're pulling out fixtures where we really can't even reuse these chassis anymore. There's no retrofit kit anymore. So that essentially is going to recycling.
Right.
There's a lot. So those are like, for most of the general lighting in our projects, we have a lot of like decorative fixtures, right? And so at the time, the designer thought, hey, this would be a great like showpiece, like it's in a common area, or if it's in a beautiful reception area. If finding a new home for those is sometimes challenging, and that's where you're like, maybe that goes into like a residential project. Like for a residential owner, hey, that's a great fixture, I'll take that for my kitchen, fantastic. I'm doing a bathroom remodel, that Google doesn't need those fixtures, we'll take them. So that is where there's like that connection between, it was used in a certain function, it still has a great life, it works fine, maybe it's a fluorescent fixture, but the new owner won't care, right? And they would be fine with it. So I think that's where how to kind of connect this like network of people across projects and project types is like, it goes back to how critical that is.
Definitely a one person's trash, another person's treasure.
Yeah.
Mentality. We're have a little bit of time here left. I want to ask a couple more questions and then open it up to Q&A to our audience here. But I want to ask each of you, what has a successful deconstruction and/or reuse project looked like in your experience? Maybe a particular accomplishment as a part of that, or just an awesome example.
Let me jump in there. I mentioned it earlier, the movie Matrix. So the last two, it was a trilogy. The last two, Reloaded and Revolutions, were really filmed together. And the three major sets, the first one where the big fight is in a tenement project between our hero and Agent Smith. And then there was the freeway chase scene. And then there was the at the center of the earth with the Oracle speaking and so forth. And those are the three sets that we worked on. The real benefit of that was, and it was probably our high point, we had 95.2% diversion on the landfill. It was also the first time that we actually beat the demolition contractor because their disposal was so high and the cost was so enormous. But that literally was the first time we beat them on price. Because the movie sets, although they may say oh yeah, come on in, they want to do the right thing. It's like anything commercial. It's all about the money, and we were able to beat them. But then beyond that, a lot of the materials wound up because we couldn't absorb everything that was there. I mean, it was a freeway that was 1.3 miles long, and all the stuff that went into the sidewalls and so forth. All that was disassembled in panels and shipped to Mexico and used as roof panels on homes down there. And we had such a great diversion that Warner Brothers got an international humanitarian award for that. So it it really worked out, and that again goes back to using the materials in a redevelopment community redevelopment situation. Here they were donated; they didn't have to buy them, but nonetheless, it was that was one of the big benefits of deconstruction, in addition to diversion from the landfill.
Fantastic. How about you, Leslie?
So I'm working on a project now, so I can't give like the end results of it, but it's been a very rewarding project. It's a residential structure, about 11,000 square feet, very, very unique structure. I think it's about 20 years old, or it was built about 20 years ago by and it was designed by a fairly prominent architect. The house was on many thousands of acres. And so, you know, the value of the property was in the land and not that house. And the house was so unique. It was really meant for the people that, you know, had it designed and built. And so the new owner wanted something different. And so they were going to be taking the house down and rebuilding. And they wanted to do deconstruction. The builder actually, you know, wasn't so sure and was saying, hey, look, you can bury a lot of the debris on your land. You have so much land, you can just bury it there. And there were some, you know, reasons why that would have been somewhat advantageous to the client, because it was a very remote site. Roads had to be built for this project to get the material, you know, out of there. But the homeowner or the, you know, the owner said, no, you know, I don't, environmentally, that's not what I want to do. And so they consulted with the deconstruction contractor and with me. And the homeowner didn't need that preliminary estimate of donation value to determine if it was financially feasible, because they wanted to do it because of the environmental aspect of it, because of the community aspect of it, because all those materials, you know, salvageable, reusable materials were going to their local nonprofit and could stay in the community. And so, you know, the project started deconstruction, I want to say in November. And it was in a mountain area, so they had a lot of snow. They had to build the roads. The property had a living roof. So by the time they got to that part of it, it was frozen. But, you know, the builder, the homeowner, the deconstruction contractor, everyone was really excited about doing it. And you don't often get a lot of excitement on the demo side of things, right? So it was fun because the team was excited about the possibilities and the opportunities that were going to come out of it. So the deconstruction company did a great job. A lot of materials were salvaged. They expected the house to be much more difficult. Like they expected there to be a lot more glue. And they were able to salvage a lot more than what they expected. So it was a fun project. I don't even know the final value because I haven't gotten to it, that part of it yet. So, but it was nice to see somebody, you know, not be driven by the financial aspect of it.
That's awesome. How about you, Marcus?
Yeah, I'll give like, yeah, the only, so where this really became more personal for me was, God, I guess maybe like 6-7 years ago, I was working on a couple projects, and two specifically at the same time. One was for a nonprofit, and, you know, they were looking at refreshing their space, right? It wasn't even a full build out, a full project, right? And then the other project was a build out for 5 floors for this larger commercial client focusing on consumer goods, right? And the space that they were moving into had 5 different floors, all with each of them had different tenants at the time. So it really kind of goes back to this like idea of this material bank thing. So the nonprofit, and they actually happen to be within the same block in San Francisco, right? Like in proximity. And so with these two projects happening, and that's where you started to think about like connecting the dots, right? Where here's a project that is in need. There's all this, like they need light fixtures, they need materials. Here's a project where the client is moving in, they need to they're going to redesign. They're not going to use everything. There's doors coming out of this project. There's light fixtures. There's finished material. Could this project use it? And they did. So I think that was like, for me, like the accomplishment of like, this could happen between two projects, two Gensler projects that I happened to be part of, right? So it was kind of within my, you know, the teams that I was leading. But could this happen to every project? What happens if we started to multiply that just within our firm? Say we multiply that outside, say within that city block, all this was happening at the same time, right? Where projects could actually start to share materials with one another, even within the same building. So for me, those two projects happening at the same time was this kind of like eye-opening experience where, you know, it's possible, and it was successful. Both the clients, even though they didn't know each other, the contractors were not the same contractor. People were behind it and excited by it because they realized like the alternate was just, it's just going to go into some dumpster and maybe some of it will be recycled, but that, you know, that was the only alternate. So this other, you know, having that kind of like experience and having the opportunity to, and it was really the nonprofit client that really kind of was like behind it, not just because, hey, we need it, but they were really behind it from a sustainability standpoint. Was kind of a great experience. And it's kind of like, for me, how I really got into this, you know, like really kind of started to think and focus on that. And that in itself, honestly, was one of the things that triggered the research paper that I shared with you guys of What's Old is New Again.
Fantastic. Thank you all for sharing those. Those are inspiring. Just sounds cheesy to say, but they very much are. So thank you for sharing those. So I have one more kind of scripted question for you guys, and then I want to shift to our Q&A here. But for the audience, I want to know what each of you think something is that our attendees can do to start advocating for deconstruction on their and reuse on their projects today, right? On the projects they're working on right now. What's one of the first things that we can start doing? Maybe we'll start back with you, Marcus, and we'll work our way back to you, Ted. And I'll quickly say, audience, please go ahead, start filling up our chat box with questions, and we'll fire those off after this one.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I would say, like, going back to like what Leslie was saying, like, say, you know, calling it, getting away from the word demolition and thinking about the word and term deconstruction, right? So really taking more time on those plans, like what are the notes? What are the things that we're going to add to those plans? Like, it's a deconstruction phase that we're thinking about here, right? It's a pre-decon phase. Like, it's like, so you really start to put information on the drawings early, and so that the folks that are looking at them have all that information, and the people that will be using the drawings after, right? When the project is done, we've all moved on, it's 10 years later, new team. When they pull those drawings out and they look at them, there's information there to help them figure out what to do with the materials that were placed in the project.
Moving down the line, how about you, Leslie? What advice do you have to share?
I think, you know, along the same lines as what Marcus said, which is even, you know, can you, and I don't know, but would it be possible to name the demo page the deconstruction page? And, you know, you started out and the focus is on the deconstruction, so that when builders are bidding, you know, they almost are, not that they're being forced to bid it with deconstruction, but those builders who have been doing deconstruction, they understand it's easy, they understand the benefits, but those builders who haven't yet done it need some motivation. And this may just kind of frame it to where they have to learn about it. They have to start thinking about it differently. They can't just keep doing it the way they've always done it. Especially in communities, or, you know, I'm in the East Bay, in San Francisco East Bay, and it's the least green county around. And builders, you know, the only builders that really embrace it are those who believe in the environmental aspects of it. So, you know, if they were having to bid and they were bidding off a set of plans that said deconstruction, it might change things.
Thank you so much. How about you, Ted?
Both Marcus and Leslie have wanted to get rid of the word demolition. I want to add another word to that I'm really working on trying to get rid of, and that's recycling. We have put so much emphasis on recycling, and the contractors have, the cities have, the zero waste people have. We've got to get reuse to a much, and it is in the cycle, reduce, right, reuse, yeah, but that's only words. You know, we've got to get that inculcated within the, you know, within our vocabulary, that the first thing we've got to think about first is what can we reuse.
Thank you. I think all sage advice. So with that, let's go ahead and shift over to some audience questions. So first one is, this looks like this one's directed to you, Marcus. It's you had mentioned having partnership with contractors from early stages of the project. It looks like this is a multi-part question. So first, do you anticipate challenges in convincing contractors to source reused materials? I guess I'll maybe cap it there to start.
Yeah, I think that comes into like the risk piece, right? And like what risk are they taking? Warranties, like all of those things. Yes, of course, right? And I think this is where the education piece is really going to come into play, right? That there is to start to help like discuss the risk, right? What are the risks? The storage piece, right? How is it stored? Where is it stored? So that's still part of the conversation. That's still something that, you know, we're personally working on, right? But there are contractors out there that are also thinking about this as well, and they've kind of done some of the legwork. So it's not just all on us, like the architects, designers, that are trying to figure that out.
Totally. I think the tail end of this question too is regarding, I guess, is there a course of action after the pricing has been received? Maybe if it seems that it's coming in, you know, high as I'm sure it may for deconstructing versus demolishing, or like you said, storing. What can we do to still keep it in play?
Yeah, I think this is where the so the notes and the drawings, right? So you can start to, because it will be more expensive, right? The way these things were constructed, it's not going to be like what Ted was saying, like it's a bulldozer. Like if you have like the bulldozer in this project where they're just going to come in and take everything out, there's going to be a cost saving or cost. It's going to be cheaper to do that, right, than to try to take everything apart. I think it's just, this is where this like engagement piece, when I talked about like the research from Let's Hold This New Again, the engagement piece, the stakeholders, like talking to the client about why this is important and how this could, you know, the benefit of it, right? So, you know, this is again the partnership piece too, like where folks like Leslie would help identify, hey, by taking these things apart, by getting them appraised, maybe there's some value in them, right? That could come back to you, client, in some way.
Absolutely. It looks like there's one more for you, Marcus. In the case of the first client, I think you're seeing it too, the project where you had two projects going on, we're able to
David's
swap.
question. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Was there essentially a benefit to one and the other by way of that exchange?
Yeah, that one was really just donate to donate. I mean, donate. There wasn't even credits or anything like that. It was just purely communication. This is what's happening, and it was donate based only, right? There was no like bartering, price reduction, and you know, as an architect, we're not in the business of being, you know, the broker between, you know, the various. So it was really just like we're just these
Finding
materials are finding out. Yeah. So that's all it was. It was just connecting the dots, getting something from site A to site B. But I think going forward, as we start to build this model, we're going to need to start to consider that, right? Because not everything's going to be just for donation, right? And so certain clients are probably going to want to start to see like some sort of value, right? Especially if their stuff is still good condition, and if it can value their project, their new project, right? So so that goes back to the partnership piece, because architects are not, we're going to focus on the design piece. We'll start to learn a little bit more about the, you know, as we help our clients navigate the process, but partnerships on how and when and what will happen, you know, to exchange the materials will be very important.
No doubt. I think those were all the questions we've received thus far. I want to open it up if anybody else wants to unmute themselves and share any other questions you have for our panelists. Anyone brave enough to share a question you have?
So I will, since nobody else is, and I'm always good to ask a bunch of questions. So one of the applications that we've often thought about, and I don't know who would be better at this, at Ted or Marcus, but you know, from what I understand, the structural engineering of recycled lumber limits its use in structural applications. It has to be essentially graded, and we've seen that used lumber is super dry, so it doesn't accept nails well. Was wondering if either of you had experience with reusing framing lumber in a non-structural application. Is that a fairly common practice, or is it primarily kind of, you know, homeowners going to the reuse people and picking up a load of 2x4s to go build a shed in the backyard or whatever? And I was wondering if you guys could speak to that. Thank you.
What do you think, Marcus?
Well, I'm not, yeah, so I, other than the material, and it wasn't really like framing, it was, you know, the example that I gave David was, you know, our work on Etsy with the water tower and, you know, turning that into stair treads for the interior stair. But I haven't really been, I'm not so familiar with like wood frame construction. And early in my career, I was involved in residential work and I switched over to the commercial side. So Ted, you probably maybe have more insight on trying to answer David's question, maybe from your experience too.
Yeah, there's two parts to that. The framing lumber, well, first of all, lumber represents probably 25% of the total volume that goes through the place. You know, that just shows you how big, you know, lumber is, and quantity. And most of it does go to DIYers. When we would get older growth lumber, a lot of that would go to woodworkers, but we don't, there must be a hoarding by people of old growth lumber. We just don't see it much anymore. And we certainly don't see any redwood. That I know is being hoarded somewhere, you know, trading it for Bitcoin or something like that. But what we do see a lot of used lumber now is looking at it in mass timber framing, CLT, cross-laminated timbers. There's a group at Michigan State University that is a guy by the name of John. He's got a CLT lab up there. The two things they're looking at is I can't think of what the second one is lumber in CLT, and you know, if we do that, boy, everybody knows all the articles on CLT now. In 10, 20 years, it's going to be a huge market. And I think that's going to be an ideal, from a framing standpoint, I think it's going to be an ideal market for used lumber. Oh, the other one that they're looking at, by the way, and just as a side note, is lignin. Lignin being that beast that holds a tree together and all the components and so forth. It's really a natural glue. Well, that is being salvaged and used in CLT, or attempting to be. That's another one of the studies that they're working with, and they got a grant from Forest Products Laboratory to look at that. Anyway, little plug for MSU, even though I'm from Ohio State.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
I have a question that's somewhat related to this current topic. I'm actually a structural engineer, but I have a passion for sustainability and the environment. And I'm glad that Ted brought up CLT, something that we're focusing on right now as well. But Ted, you also mentioned earlier about reclaimed lumber and the grading process. I think David also mentioned that too. What are some of the thoughts or ideas for reusing other materials like concrete or steel? Is there a possibility of going from like commercial level deconstruction materials and using them in residential size projects? Is there anything that's sort of being put together or discussed? Are you hearing rumblings about trying to reuse structural materials? We're always sort of tied to what is the strength of the material, and we need to go and test it. Is there anything out there for possibility of reuse of other materials?
there's a lot of materials out there that there's a possibility for reuse. The problem on the commercial side of it is, from a source standpoint, is the quantity. Yeah, we've got 3,500 doors, hollow core, 8-foot with panic hardware on them. So that's one problem. The other problem on the commercial side of it is our codes. And it's going back into a commercial building. There's a lot of code considerations. Is that fire door rating the same 20 years ago as it is today? Is the panic hardware the same? Are the lock sets? There is a real problem with codes, certainly on the commercial. There is in residential too, but when you consider most residential, at least from our standpoint, most of our customers are DIYers. So throw the codes out the window. They don't apply. So there's a lot more flexibility in the residential market, but I know that with and it was brought up earlier by Alex, and that's the BAM, or maybe it was Marcus. The building is a materials bank. In Europe, that's becoming a major focus, and those buildings are all commercial, and they're looking at what not only at old buildings are trying to decide what's in them, but also on new buildings, and really building a material passport that we'll know in 5 years or 10 years what we're able to use. So commercial's coming. It's just going to take us a little longer, but it's coming, and it's a freight train. That's what I know.
May, thank you so much for your question, and thanks for joining us tonight. We're a few minutes over. I want to be respectful of everybody's time, so I think we're going to wrap up here. But thank you so much again to our panel, to you, Ted, Leslie, and Marcus. Thank you to my fellow COTE committee members. Thank you to the AIA, of course, AIA Silicon Valley, for supporting us always. And thank you, last but certainly not least, to our audience for joining us tonight, for your questions, for your interest, and we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Good evening.
Thanks,